when we talk about progress, what we're really trying to pin down, I think, is the idea that we are improving in our state of affairs, in our way of life, in the things that matter most to us, right? It's an attempt to capture the idea that the present is in some meaningful way better than the past, and the future will be better than the present, right? And the world we have now, I think, is to a significant extent driven by this idea of progress, and this continuous growth and expansion in pursuit of more profit is fueled by this idea, the idea of progress, of making new and better things, new and better technologies. And innovation and improvement are the underlying principles that drive all this economic activity and shape the world we live in and shape our experience of what it is to be alive. It's clear to see that progress is obviously a really important concept. It's got a major impact on the world and the way we live. One, it does drive tech innovation and a good deal of economic growth. It also drives destruction of the biosphere. It drives industrial pollution. It drives this ever-increasing extraction from the natural world. It drives toxic pollution, drives economic inequality, and produces major issues for human health and well-being, and of course, big new tech risks. Right? So it's clearly not a story that is all good. There are some bad things that come with it. We're in a position where the thing that most people think of as the key to a better future is actually the same thing that's causing our biggest problems at the scale of the whole planet.
Welcome to Entangled World, where we explore our interrelated existential, social, economic, ecological, and technological challenges, their underlying drivers, and how a more beautiful world might emerge. I'm your host, Najia Shaukat Lepsin. I'm a daughter of Pakistani Muslim immigrants, a mom, and an intersystems thinker. Join me on a journey to discover what is uniquely and meaningfully ours to do at this pivotal moment in time in service to the sacredness of life. Quick note before we get started, if you haven't already listened to the first full episode of this podcast called What is the Metacrisis, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that first. It's really a foundational episode that provides a lot of the grounding that is important for all the episodes that follow. Today, I had the pleasure of connecting more formally with a dear colleague of mine, Alex Randall. Alex is a brilliant and kind human who also works at the Civilization Research Institute, a think tank aiming to support the emergence of a mature global civilization. Alex has a background in research science, art, and government, and his current work is focused on sharing some of the foundational concepts for understanding the state of the world and likely future paths for humanity. In this episode, we really unpack a recent paper called Development in Progress, which was released by the Consilience Project, an initiative of the Civilization Research Institute. Obviously, I highly recommend you take the time to read the paper. It's truly an enlightening piece of work and explores the progress narrative, or this idea that technological innovation, markets, and our institutions have unequivocally enabled us to live better and more comfortable lives. While, of course, modernity has had many positive impacts, for example, cures to certain diseases, technologies that allow us to connect with people across the globe, what we explore is that progress, as we currently define it, ignores or downplays the scale of its side effects. And we have now reached a point that across many different areas of what might be called progress, these side effects have essentially piled up to create existential risks that threaten the very continuation of all of life on our beloved planet. The good news is that there are some relatively simple ways that we can begin to improve our actions in ways that mitigate the downsides of progress. Alex is very clear to say that it's not that progress is bad, but it's that when we widen the lens of progress, we see unintended harms, some of which could have been mitigated in ways that would have made a meaningful difference. I know that many of you listening who have come to understand the metacrisis are hungry to know what you can do. So I think this is a really exciting episode because we get into some innovative frameworks that the Civilization Research Institute has developed, things like prudent problem solving and yellow teaming. And these are ways to improve how we take action in the world that anyone can put into practice today in your organizations and in your lives. The development and progress paper goes into a lot more detail. So if this episode piques your interest, please do check it out. I'll link it in the show notes. This may be one of the most critical topics of our time. If you find this episode valuable, please subscribe, share it with a friend or two. And also, I would really appreciate if you'd leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps the podcast to grow and brings these ideas to more people. And it helps me feel like it's worthwhile and something that I should keep doing. Okay, let's dive in. Welcome, Alex, to the Entangled World podcast. I'm really excited to have you here today. We work together at the Civilization Research Institute, and we're often on Zoom calls, but today I get to have you as a guest on my podcast, so this will be fun.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here. Excited to talk about progress with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we dive in, I'd like to talk a little bit about your story. So I think everyone who comes to see that the major crises of our world are entangled and then really decides to reorient their life to working on the meta crisis or the poly crisis has a unique story typically. So can you talk a bit about your journey into this work?
Yeah, as you say, I think everyone has a different path, and mine begins with, I think, kind of a love of science and a desire to be a scientist. I wanted to work in research and find out how the world worked, basically. And so in a former life, I did a PhD in neuroscience, and I spent 4 years working in a research lab, and that was hard. Anyone who's done a science PhD would tell you it can be quite a lonely, isolating experience, and it can be pretty tough. And it hugely depends on loads of other variable factors like the people you're working with and personalities and like the field of study you're in. But it was very challenging, and the exposure to that system, the system of academia, kind of led me to a place where I realized that it was kind of broken. It wasn't the system that I thought it was. I couldn't see a career path for me moving forwards there. It felt to me like so much of whether you might make good discoveries or you might contribute something of meaning was either down to luck or also down to kind of politics. And I decided it wasn't for me. And so I spent the next almost decade working in the UK government instead on a wide range of policy areas. And this kind of gave me an opportunity to look at how policymaking is done in relation to all the world's big problems, how we try and solve them at the nation state level, the kind of problem solving approaches that we take. And I think that was a sobering experience, because seeing the way that well-intended and carefully designed policy interventions came into contact with the world of power and politics kind of makes you reflect that, this isn't actually going to solve the problems that we want to solve here. The approach we have to governing large-scale systems clearly wasn't driving things in a better direction or solving any of the most significant problems in the world. So by having those kind of joint experiences in academia, then in government and policymaking, I think put me in a place where it was kind of painful to exist in proximity to this huge machine that was obviously insufficient to the problems of the world, and feel like I was burning up life energy on trying to solve problems via those means. And that led me to the work of Daniel Schmachtenberger and Zach Stein. And I ended up bringing some of the skills I'd developed in research and writing and policy and government to the work on the Consilience Project, to the editorial work we were doing there, to writing these articles. So yeah, I think that's my kind of path. I think it would be incomplete not to mention like becoming a parent, right? When I think anyone with kids knows, that experience can totally shift your understanding of what really matters, of what your values are, and whether you're happy to keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I found it much less bearable. It was already unbearable. Having kids really highlighted how unbearable it was. And I feel really lucky now to be able to work on some of the most important set of projects that I've encountered with the people at CRI, with you.
Yeah, I think it is interesting because so many of us do come to this work from different backgrounds. I came from the public education sector and similarly was sort of feeling like we were taking such a myopic approach to looking at education and what success looks like in education, and that there was this whole other world of thinking about human growth and development that really just wasn't even discussed in public education systems. So I resonate with your story. And then of course the parent bit, of course, just changes you as a person for sure and refocuses you on what really matters. So one of the reasons that I have you here today is to talk about a recent paper that the Consilience Project put out called The Development in Progress that you were involved in the writing of. And I know you did an enormous amount of research before and during the writing of the paper. It's truly a remarkable piece of work. It is packed with ideas that could actually probably be in an entire book, but you and the team did an incredible job of really making it into a concise paper that I highly recommend everyone to read. It's it's not a short paper, but it's quite a readable one. And it really digs into this concept of progress and what progress is. And so I'd love for us to begin by just talking a little bit about what is the progress narrative and why was this an important topic to write about now?
Yeah, it's there's no denying it's not a short piece. It is more like a small book. And one of the reasons for that is that when you're trying to talk about progress, you're actually talking about a very large and important set of related concepts that are connected to so many other things that matter. And if you try and constrain the discussion too much, you end up building an argument that you're not fully explaining. And so to be complete, we just expanded it. We let go of the desire for brevity and concision and tried to be a bit more complete, describing in a relatively total way how the definition we have of progress now is incomplete and damaging, and then also pointing out the path to a better version of progress towards a future trajectory that would be much more beneficial for everyone. When we talk about progress, what we're really trying to pin down, I think, is the idea that we are improving in our state of affairs, in our way of life, in the things that matter most to us, right? It's an attempt to capture the idea that the present is in some meaningful way better than the past, and that the future will be better than the present, right? In the past, many cultures viewed history as cyclical. So there was this sense that there was a period of improvement that led up to a golden age, and then there was a decline. And social or technological improvements were acknowledged, but not really seen as part of a longer term linear progression. This continual state of improvement. And the idea of linear progress, that we are going collectively over time from a less good state to a more good state, I think is more connected to the idea there's some kind of culmination. There is a final end state of advancement. And that the roots of that idea are religious, particularly from the Judeo-Christian tradition. The idea that there will be, there was a creation, there will eventually be a judgment day, and that the history between it is, in essence, like a purposeful unfolding of God's plan, right?
Right.
So the idea of progress that we've got now is shaped instead by the recent history of experience, the way of viewing the world that came out of the Enlightenment, that was influenced by rationalism and empiricism and science, and later than that, industrialization and the development in philosophical thinking that accompanied those moments in history. Ideas such as positivism, the philosophy that It kind of contains the idea that human societies progress through stages culminating in a scientific era, a scientific worldview. And there's a whole bunch of other philosophical ideas that led into this more secular version of progress that we have now. You can point to Hegel and the evolution of the world spirit through dialectics, through this kind of sense that progress is a complex process of resolving contradictions, of going through thesis and antithesis to synthesis, and going through that process of ups and downs, of mistakes and learnings. We come to a place where we get gradual improvement over time. And the political philosophies of the last 200 years or so that are so familiar to us, that form the world around us now and form our understanding of recent history, those things have helped contribute to the really secular view of progress we have now. And the world we have now, I think, is to a significant extent driven by this idea of progress. You could say that for better or worse, the global economy runs on progress. Tech innovation is a primary catalyst for economic growth. And this continuous growth and expansion and pursuit of more profit is fueled by this idea, the idea of progress, of making new and better things, new and better technologies. And innovation and improvement are the underlying principles that drive all this economic activity and shape the world we live in and shape our experience of what it is to be alive. It's clear to see that progress is obviously a really important concept. It's got a major impact on the world and the way we live. And the problem with it, the reason why it's so important to write about it and to think about it and talk about it, is that it's actually incredibly destructive. Right? One, it does drive tech innovation and a good deal of economic growth. It also drives destruction of the biosphere. It drives industrial pollution. It drives this ever-increasing extraction from the natural world. It drives toxic pollution, drives economic inequality, and produces major issues for human health and well-being, and of course, big new tech risks. Right? So it's clearly not a story that is all good. There are some bad things that come with it. It's reasonable to say that the vast majority of the most difficult problems we face, things like industrial pollution or nuclear war or species extinction, these are the unintended outcomes of humans attempting to solve other problems. So we're in a position where the thing that most people think of as the key to a better future is actually the same thing that's causing our biggest problems at the scale of the whole planet. You can say that progress is upstream of all of the greatest risks we face now. And that's why it's critical to deepen the conversation about how we define it and how we pursue it. Because if we keep doing what we're doing now, we're going to increase the scale of the problems that we're already failing to address. So I think it's about making sure that we are understanding that talking about progress, what progress is about making changes in the world. And sometimes when we make a change in the world, whether it's taking a certain action or inventing a new technology, the world ends up in a worse state that is not really connected to our original intentions. The implication, though, is that progress always involves this getting better, this improvement thing. But when you earnestly think about all of the ways in which new tech impacts the world, it's often the case that things didn't turn out the way we wanted them to. We didn't intend for that to be the case. In the same way we didn't intend to get species extinction at scale, but that's what we've got by pursuing the progress we have now.
Yeah, and I think the social media example is a great example of how we didn't sort of intend for the, addiction that has resulted from the limbic hijack because of a business model that is based on keeping users on a platform for as long as possible, or the mental health crisis that is now very apparent amongst our youth. We didn't intend for any of those things to happen, but that is what happened with one sort of version of social media that was essentially rooted in this idea of, connecting people, bringing them together. And not to say that it didn't do that. It did do that in many ways, but there were also these other effects that really, I think, if anyone had really sat down and thought about them, it probably would have been pretty easy to see that a business model based on attention was just going to be bad for people. And so one of the things we'll talk about today is how, well, you can't predict all of the consequences from taking an action, that we can really do a much better job of that. But before we get there, one of the things that I really appreciated about this paper was the kind of really balanced view that it took on progress. So there are the very kind of pro-progress people who say that, there's no better time to be alive. On the opposite end are people who might say that progress on a whole is destroying humanity. And so there can be this binary that progress is either good or it's bad. And what I love about this paper is, how the approach was just much more nuanced. And in fact, you begin the paper by saying that our current idea of progress is actually immature. So can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I think the word immature is valuable because it mirrors a pretty standard model of human development, right? When we are young, then we are immature. We take things for granted that we depend upon without realizing it. We focus on near-term desires, and we don't think too much about the longer-term costs of our choices. When we're immature, then it's reader would say that we're not yet able to kind of take on and understand the perspectives of others, or to consider the wider consequences of our actions. And the kind of progress we pursue now does precisely the same thing. It focuses on the achievement of certain goals and ignores the wider costs. It undermines many other systems and processes that we actually need to survive. Progress, as we define it now, unsustainably extracts from and pollutes the natural world upon which we depend, and it doesn't account for that cost. But immaturity it's a nice frame for this. It allows you to bring in lots of nice comparisons and to frame the idea in a way that's relatable, but really it's just one of many useful frames. We use fake progress as opposed to real progress, like fake progress being the kind of progress that pretends that it's actually about improving everything for everyone, when in fact it's only improving things according to very narrow metrics and ignoring all of the harms it causes elsewhere. And you can call it naive progress. The point is that the current pursuit of progress fails to acknowledge, in fact, all of its impacts in reality, regardless of whether they're positive or negative.
I love the analogy that you use in the paper, which is really rooted in developmental psychology, which is really this idea of, when we're toddlers, we're immature. We may throw our plates on the ground when our parents try to feed us or refuse to go to bed, or, even hit our parents, the very people that we rely on to survive. And as we grow older and, we develop a prefrontal cortex that is able to engage in more executive decision-making, make better decisions, we're able to respond in different ways. And I think as a culture, we are kind of like that toddler where we're throwing a temper tantrum, we are causing ecological destruction, we are consuming the very substrate that supports life, all in the name of some definition of progress that in the end doesn't actually leave anyone better off. I think those who support the progress narrative often point to statistics across measures like poverty and violence reduction, improvements in life expectancy, literacy rates, education. And one of the things I really appreciated in the paper is that you talk about this idea of like when you look at very narrow cherry-picked metrics, it can look like progress is happening. But if you actually widen the lens and look more broadly, a different kind of picture emerges. And one of the, most, I think, jaw-dropping examples in the paper that you really unpack is around the Haber-Bosch process, which really, underpinned the Green Revolution, has now been credited with preventing the starvation of millions of people around the world. And it did do that, but that's an incomplete story. And if you widen the lens of analysis of the Haber-Bosch process, I think a different kind of story emerges. So can you talk a bit about that particular example? Because I just think it's such a clear one of how optimizing for one metric, which was reducing world hunger, often causes problems in other areas.
Haber-Bosch is an interesting example because it's an example that we chose in the paper because it's so often held up as being kind of a primary instance of incredible technological progress that has done a lot of good. It's solved world hunger, basically. And I think it's important to note that immaturity as a frame doesn't discount that. Just because you can prioritize near-term gains at the expense of other long-term realities, it doesn't mean that you only get bad stuff out of it. Like, yes, avoiding starvation, avoiding hunger has been like one of the most important drivers of human activity over the course of human history. And developing a process that allowed us to enhance our food security and improve land efficiency. And there are a whole bunch of positive things that flowed from Haber-Bosch as a process. And in no way do we mean to diminish the significance of those achievements. But there are a lot of other negative externalities that flowed directly and indirectly as second or third order effects from Haber-Bosch that are not really thought about, or there are no good solutions that are being put forward to address them. But those costs are still there. That's still there in reality, whether you want the net to be there or not. The addition of synthetic fertilizers to the earth has had incredible impacts on how we eat, on our nutrition, on our physiology, on our mental well-being, on the planetary ecosystems, the biosphere, the oceans. The dead zones in the oceans are, to a certain degree, caused by nitrogen runoff, the process of eutrophication in bodies of water adjacent to agricultural land. So yes, we have more food security. Yes, we have land that can produce more crops than we could before. And there are some good things that have flowed from that. There are some consequential, obviously negative things that have also flowed from it. And so the idea with Haber-Bosch is to try and make it was a long way from complete, right? Like there's always more that can be said about this. You can go into ever greater detail, but the purpose of exploring that example was to show just how wide-ranging and how complex some of the externalities of a single technical innovation like Haber-Bosch can be. So we listed like 30 bullet points of side effects of Haber-Bosch across a bunch of different areas. So impacts on human health and well-being, impacts on the environment, and impacts on the structures of civilization. And we could go into a lot of detail and talk about micronutrient deficiencies and the effect on growth and development. We can talk about the impact of hybridization of crops and what that means for humans' health, and the change towards more grains in the diet and what that does to our teeth and our jaws and our bone structure. We can talk about what it did to urban planning and the move from rural living to cities. Like the consequences of Haber-Bosch are extremely complex and nonlinear. And what we were trying to show with that example is simply that there is a reality that sits behind a good narrative. And, there are some estimates as to the number of people that wouldn't be in existence were it not for Haber-Bosch, something like 2/5 of the world population. It's a lot of people, and all these people have come into existence and have perfectly valid hopes and dreams and complex lives, and they wouldn't have been here without this invention. And the consequences of that are vast for the planet and the biosphere and the way we live. So Haber-Bosch is just one example, and you're perfectly correct to say that the way we look at it is really narrow. The same could be said for any example of progress you'd like to put forward as a demonstration of the fact that things are getting better. So in the paper, we used life expectancy, reduction in violence, reduction in poverty, and increasing literacy and education around the world. These are the canonical examples of progress. And what we're trying to do is kind of quite gently just widen the aperture on our view of these of these examples, and say, well, actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. Yes, we might be living a bit longer, but part of the reason it looks like we're living longer on life expectancy charts is because of the reduction in infant mortality. So it's a statistical change in how we represent the average age people reach. And even if we are living longer, the quality of life we're living is by most measures, most meaningful measures, much lower. We are living the extra years we get in a state of poor health and loneliness, and often on a bunch of medications that have complex effects in the body. So we're just trying to show a more complete picture, a long way from totally complete, obviously, but something that is more representative of reality and is not a motivated story designed to sell us the idea that progress as we pursue it now is always net good.
Yeah. And one of the, I think, really important distinctions that you make in the paper is the difference between what we often call advancement versus betterment. Can you talk
Yeah.
about that a little? Because I think it's a really important distinction to unpack.
Yeah, this is really interesting, right? Because we're coming into the domain of like language and semantics here.
Mhm.
If you look up definitions of the word progress, often you'll get these terms conflated within the definition. You'll get synonyms like improvement or betterment or advancement or something about moving forwards in a state of goodness. But like you can make a choice to use these words in a way that actually can be quite clarifying. So when you think of advancement, you think of a narrow kind of advancement in the way that a new technology advances. You can say that it's gone through a process that demonstrates a narrow technical improvement.
Mhm.
So you could talk about things like efficiency gains or an increasing impact in the world in some way, an expanded capability set of a tool or a technology. And so you can think of an example like the difference between early computers that took up entire rooms and the kind of ultra thin laptops or tablets we have now. It's the same basic idea, but it's gone through this process of performance enhancement and capability expansion and efficiency gain. And these are narrow advancements in the sense that we are looking at the narrow metric of what the tool does. What's the tool's intended function? What we intended for it to do when we came up with the idea, but we're not thinking about all of the other impacts it has in reality, all of the other things that kind of technology has changed in the world, how it changes human minds, how it changes human health. What kind of novel chemicals does it release into the biosphere as a result of its manufacturing? It requires the mining of substances from the earth with all of the associated mining runoff. If we're just looking at the technology itself and measuring its performance in the narrow sense, then we are talking about a tool advancing. That can be thought of as advancement. But what would it mean for a tool like that to lead to something like betterment, holistic betterment? It would mean that the tool isn't just achieving its intended effects, but it also doesn't produce negative side effects elsewhere down the line. Maybe it would even produce positive side effects, positive externalities, right? So betterment is about this. There is a kind of value judgment there about what it is to be in a better state. And if you're going to optimize and measure against a narrow set of metrics and consider that narrow kind of advancement indicative of progress and just ignore everything else, then we're saying it's not a particularly complete view of reality. Whereas you could make a decision to focus on all of the ways in which a technology or tool would impact reality and try and work out whether it's actually improving the things that are most meaningful to us over the course of a human lifetime. Is it leading to betterment in the broadest sense?
I thought this was a really poignant quote from the paper. Our governments and private corporations are applying vast quantities of human ingenuity, capital, and construction effort to the creation of planetary scale ubiquitous surveillance and kill machines. While all of this effort is advancing the state of the art in technological terms, can we honestly call this progress? What is better about a world in which you and your family are at risk of death by autonomous kill drones? In the sense of what really matters in a human life, is there meaningful value in any of this prodigious technological advancement? It might be powerful or even awesome, but is it good or beautiful? And I loved that quote because I think it just really paints like such a clear picture in your mind of, oh, of course there is a difference here that we're talking about.
Yeah. It was a world, right? There was a world when there weren't autonomous kill drones.
Right. Yeah.
That's the world we live in now.
Right. Right.
I know which one I'd rather live in.
Yeah. And I think a core part of the progress narrative is that idea, right? This development and technological innovation has made all of our lives better. But that's also simply not true. Those of us that are privileged, many of us who are living in the global north, rely on the exploitation and extraction and ecological destruction that happens in the global south to support our current lifestyles. The laptop that you and I are using right now to have this conversation is based on somebody who had to go into a mine to mine the minerals that were required to make this technology so that we can talk. Um, Jason Hickel, an economic anthropologist, has done some research that actually it was just so eye-opening for me when I first learned this, but he essentially showed that for every dollar of aid that the Global South receives, they lose $30 through unequal exchange with the Global North, and that the drain is to the tune of, I think it was something like $10 trillion per year. And so you could say that poor countries are actually the ones that are developing rich countries and not the other way around. And so I think there is another aspect of progress that's really important to talk about, which is the unequal impact of progress. So I was wondering if you could maybe unpack that a little bit.
So we've been talking in general about what progress is and how to define it, but we've used this phrase progress narrative to refer to this idea that is very prevalent in contemporary society, that our institutions of science and research and education and our scientific approach to the world is leading over time to a net improvement in the state of human affairs, right?
Right.
This narrative, it makes sense if you're only considering a kind of narrow set of outcomes, if you are looking only at a certain set of outcomes. And what you're describing in the question you just posed is the inequality that sits behind progress. Many people have written about this. Power and Progress, which came out last year, is an excellent book that looks at this in detail. And it's pretty obvious to demonstrate the benefits of progress as we pursue it now, and the harms as well, are not distributed in an even or balanced way, right? There are a million examples. There's high quality healthcare or education or nutrition or access to a certain set of life experiences available to some people more than others. And it's largely dependent on where and to whom you were born.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The benefits of progress, they accrue in some places, and the harms tend to accrue in other parts of the world. The industrial scale pollution that enables the way of life and the array of consumer products available to the average American, that pollution tends to stack up in parts of the world that also tend to do the manufacturing and happen to be poorer, right? Yeah. So one of the questions that we wanted to highlight in this paper is progress for whom? Progress at what cost? Right? And there are so many ways to draw the boundaries here. You can see that upper classes, elites across societies have benefited way more than lower classes who've had to bear the majority of the costs of the externalities. It's actually a good example of this is like the early years of the Industrial Revolution. So when new methods of production and manufacturing were being rolled out in the Industrial Revolution, as the wealth was growing, that wealth pooled almost exclusively in a smaller group of elites. Mm-hmm. And it took it took the implementation of labor laws and education reforms and like social welfare programs. And only after that, then the benefit began to affect the population of workers that were supporting it. Mm-hmm. Another good example is the distinction between human and non-human worlds. So the progress as we pursue it now has almost exclusively harmed non-human life. It's very hard to think of any examples, where it's totally human-centric.
Yeah.
Everything that is not human has basically been harmed by the processes that underlie progress as we pursue it now.
I think I just saw an article that was making the rounds about a study that was done. I may get this wrong, but I think it was over the past 30 years that essentially we've seen a 75% decline in all species, in all non-human species around the world. And so you see that the species decline is coupled with an era that many people credit with being, the most progressive that's ever been for humanity.
So it's pretty clear to see that the progress narrative kind of runs on ecological destruction. Our entire global economy runs on like extraction from the biosphere. Everything we see around us, the technology that sits squarely at the center of our attentional focus pretty much at all times now for all of our existence. As well as the infrastructure that supports its production, development, and how it gets to us. That requires extraction from nature and the production of waste at a totally unsustainable rate. And I know that many people, lots of people listening to this, will have come into contact with this idea before, that tends to shift your thinking in this more ecological direction. The idea that if you run a world on the basis of a linear materials economy that takes more from nature than it puts back, turns it into money and trash, and it's a finite planet, a finite biosphere, it's obvious that cannot continue forever. And I think when people come into contact with that idea, it really does shift their view of the world system and the way we're choosing to live now. And this is the thing, right? At the moment, progress requires precisely this kind of unsustainable ecological destruction to continue to function as it does. For most of us in the developed world, at least, it's kind of easy to avoid looking at or thinking about the ocean dead zones or extinct species or toxic chemicals accumulating within us, and instead just exist with the distraction of a shiny new device in our hands, or the endless varieties of entertainment, being lost to the modern forms of marketing that make us desire things that we don't really want or need. But, the damage, the costs, the destruction that comes with it, these unpleasant things are also an unavoidable part of the story of progress. They're an unavoidable part of the thing that we call progress now. They're just as much a part of the story of progress as screens, as iPhones, as international travel, right? It's both hard and kind of unpleasant to think frankly about the scale of damage and harm that it takes to deliver the world as we know it now. And if we keep ignoring the externalities that progress causes, they will increase in impact as new technologies become more powerful. The world we live in now is deeply interconnected, as the title of your podcast suggests.
I was thinking about sort of why the progress narrative really persists. And I think one of the reasons is that because it's quite simple. It's a story that we all want to believe. It's a story about how we are all on this journey towards a better life and that things will only continue to get better from here. And who doesn't want to believe in that, right? And so I think there is Vanessa Andreotti, who I recently had on the podcast, talked about this, but I think that there is this emotional sobriety that is really missing from our culture, and in particular from the techno-optimist worldview, which is basically this idea that human ingenuity coupled with advanced technology is the key to unlocking a better world. Techno-optimists see technology as the solution to every problem and believe that the future holds an even more comfortable and convenient life, and that AI will usher in this kind of state of abundance. And I think it was just recently, maybe it was just last week or 2 weeks ago, ex-CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, was in an interview saying that, he doesn't think we're going to hit our climate goals and that he'd rather bet on AI solving the climate problem. And so let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about, so first, what is the techno-optimist worldview and why is it flawed?
It's probably worth defining that in some detail so that we can be clear that we're trying to represent it in a way that its supporters would endorse, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to unfairly characterize a worldview that many people earnestly believe is doing good at scale. So as you said, techno-optimism is this view that human ingenuity plus technology, that's the path to a good future. And that does sound perfectly reasonable at first pass. And I think people who identify with techno-optimism, they would also point to related concepts that expand the idea, that lean back into this kind of broader progress narrative that we were describing to make it sound even more reasonable. It's not just about tech. It's also about the accumulation of knowledge over time. As humans do what we do in the age of science, we observe the universe and we conduct experiments to test our hypothesis. And things tend to get better over time as we learn more about the world and how to solve the problems with technology that we encounter within it, right? And beyond that, it's also about this kind of supporting bedrock of the institutions of the Enlightenment, alongside technology, which is the practical application of the knowledge that we're gaining about the nature of the universe. And it's this whole set of institutions and ideas and processes that together will make the world better over time on average, despite mistakes and costs. And that these things like literacy, the developments in modernity, literacy, democracy, free markets, and science, these are pro-social technologies for collective intelligence. This is like fundamental underpinning of the techno-optimist worldview. In that sense, it's effectively like a continuation of a long line of thinking in Western philosophy regarding capitalism and technology combined and where it leads us. And I think in relation to our big problems, like the stuff that you talk about on this podcast, the great crises we're facing, the techno-optimist proposal is that our problems with climate can be solved by planetary scale geoengineering designed by AI. Our problems with disease can be addressed with nanotechnology and advanced gene editing tools, and the collective coordination issues we have can be addressed by AI or AGI. And you're right. The important thing to feel into is that the techno-optimist worldview is exciting. It feels exciting. It feels positive and optimistic. It feels good. And this is supported by like some of the most recent advances in technology, reaching now view the earliest moments of the universe using space-based telescopes, and we can land rovers on Mars. And this feels like inspiring evidence for this worldview. I think there are a couple of key problems. And the primary one is that the techno-optimist worldview doesn't address how to stop our attempts at problem solving through tech innovation from causing worse problems in the future, which has been the pattern throughout history up to this point.
Yeah.
At the same time, it also doesn't really seriously seem to address the increasing scale and impact of the negative externalities that come with it. So there's this like rapidly increasing, accelerating scale of impacts, plus the fact that we do tend to cause worse problems down the line through the invention of new technologies. And there don't seem to be any good answers in the techno-optimist worldview to those problems. And it's, again, like the progress narrative, focused on the upsides and tends to explain away counter arguments with things suggestions that are not grounded in reality, that amount to cherry picking or a kind of spin, kind of motivated marketing. It's simply not making an honest endeavor to factor both positive and negative impacts of the kind of progress that's delivered the inspiring images of the early universe.
Yeah, something we often talk about on this podcast is how critical it is to, earnestly attempt to focus on the whole rather than just the parts. I love the way Nora Bateson talks about this. She sort of talks about like, where is the edge of me? I am a collection of all the tiny little organisms that live in my gut and my microbiome. I am, I am an individual in this body, but I wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the sun and for the plants that photosynthesize the sun rays and the oceans that, capture the carbon and release the oxygen that I breathe in. And I am part of the ecosystem. And so, when we think about how to solve problems, we have to first bring into perspective the whole. And I think while the scientific revolution had enormous benefits, it also left us with a legacy of thinking that really optimizes the parts over the whole. And the paper, I think, explores the dangers of attempting to understand the world through science. And I really appreciated that part of the discussion. I think that there's a section that is really worth highlighting, and it reads, "In the early phases of the scientific revolution, it was broadly accepted that the application of science to understanding the world was necessarily restricted to certain domains. Science was not considered as a way to know everything, and some aspects of a human experience, including religion, in the mind, for instance, were considered to be phenomena that could not be fully elucidated by scientific methods alone. Instead, science was seen as a means of interpreting parts of the world that were both measurable and repeatable, which provided two clear forms of value: its application in the form of technology and the ability to predict outcomes on the basis of inputs. And this ability to predict the world is why I think the scientific worldview, or at least one of the reasons why the scientific worldview gained dominance as a sort of framework for understanding the whole of reality. And it reminds me of this quote by Lao Tzu, the Taoist philosopher, who said, "Those who have knowledge don't predict. Those who predict don't have knowledge." And I think part of the growing and maturing that our society needs to do is to sort of let go of the need to predict and control so much of our world. And I wonder if, that desire could be one of the underlying really psychosocial generative dynamics driving the meta crisis. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that, the scientific worldview obviously provided comparative advantage. It allowed you to manipulate reality, and it allowed you to build tools that meant that you could build a surplus and that you could advance your military technologies relative to neighboring groups of humans. And as soon as you start to get that differential advantage come into play, it is a self-reinforcing story. We talk a little bit in the article about the idea that history is written by the winners. And the progress that we pursue now is obviously the kind of progress that allows you to be the winner. So there is this self-reinforcing process of building a narrative around how we've got to where we are in the present, and that it was all good and just and right, and that there has been this steady improvement, but it does write out of history an incredible amount of destruction, an incredible amount of lost beauty and knowledge and culture. And the scientific worldview as a dominant way of viewing reality, as a way to view the whole of reality, that thing gained in prominence over other worldviews that might have considered that there are domains that it cannot reach, because it provided such real world comparative advantage. It allowed you to win in competitive games like markets and warfare. And in that way, technology becomes obligate, but you either use it or you lose. And when you lose, you don't have a chance to write the history books. You don't have a chance to tell the stories. And when you've won, you can recast those people that you've wiped out as the antagonists and say it was good that you won and that you got to the position of dominance that you reached. But you did it using the kind of progress that is really good at developing advanced weapons. Like in one of the earlier questions, you referenced orbital kill webs. This is the cutting edge of progress as we pursue it now. Military tech development has always been the leading edge of technological capability advancement because it provides security. There are good reasons for good, justified, valid reasons. You want to protect people, and you do it using weapons. But it produces a world that's trapped in a multipolar arms race where everyone's trying to do the same thing, and it's leading to this net, much less secure picture for everyone. And all of this is the product of a scientific worldview that cannot reach parts of the experience of reality that are most meaningful to us. In the paper, we try to talk a little bit about the fact that the scientific worldview is a third-person perspective. It allows you to interrogate reality from the third person. It cannot tell you anything about the first or second person. And by third person, I mean, a good example is that of a meditator who is having their brainwaves measured by EEG. So you can see a little readout of brain waves on the screen, and you can see that as the meditator gets into a state of deeper meditation, the frequency and amplitude of the wave and the wavelength of the waves change. So you can demonstrate that simply by sitting there and doing nothing, their brain activity is changing. So you can measure a component or a proxy for what is actually going on, but you're measuring something in the domain of the third person. You're not measuring the first person experience of the meditator. You're not measuring what it feels like to be in this deeply internal state, what it feels like to slow everything down and cut out the model of the world we have around us and connect to ourselves, like this deepening sense of self-familiarity that comes with deep meditation. And it's the scientific method cannot access those parts of the world. It also happens to include a whole bunch of the most meaningful things, the things that matter most in reality. Our emotional subjective experience of the world exists within that category. And it can't access the second person, what exists between people, between beings, where relational value emerges in this space between living things. The world is a very different place if you imagine that you're the only thing in it. Science doesn't measure any of that either. It only talks about the third person. And another problem we tried to draw out, which is also, these are problems that are relevant to the way we think about progress and deliver the kind of world we're in now of increasing risks, of the increasing risk of catastrophe. So there's the third person problem, third person only problem. And then there's this fact that even within the domain of the third person, there are some things that the scientific method cannot get to. And so we talk about examples of emergence, of whole systems having effects that cannot be predicted by the sum of their parts. The scientific worldview is a reductionist, a materialist reductionist worldview that attempts to understand all of the universe by breaking it down into parts, which is reasonable, right? How do you go about working out what the universe is really about, how it works? You've got to start somewhere. So you start in a part. You've already broken the whole down into a part and tried to work out how it all fits together. And in that act of deconstruction, you end up missing a whole bunch of things that can only manifest in a state of systemic wholeness. And so the examples that we use are things like, cellular respiration emerging from a bunch of non-respiring components in the human body, or complex motor patterns that cannot be predicted by the makeup of muscles in the body and bones, or wherever you break down the complex whole of the organism, then and try to make an intervention to understand any one part of it, you have to take a part that's somewhere, and that part is not complete because you have had to, in the process of trying to understand it, dissect it from the whole. The reality doesn't make human hearts as individual separable objects in their own right. Human hearts don't exist in the universe. They only exist in the context of the whole human body. We don't get spleens that exist just in nature on their own. You have to have a spleen in the context of the whole. It makes no sense to try and explain the spleen as a separate individual object. And so there is this difficult to grasp thing that exists outside of the scientific method, which involves causation in all directions. Like even the idea of emergence, right? We have this sense that when a complex phenomenon emerges from a system, as we've been studying, we can see that something complex emerges from what we think of as as an assemblage of parts that have all come together, then even the way we're thinking about it is kind of nonsense. It's poor thinking to think of this bottom-up assembly of bits that then give rise to an emergent phenomena. Really, the causation is in all directions. It's bottom-up, top-down, middle-out. Like there is this state of systemic wholeness that produces a phenomenon that is not easy to explain. And we talk about things like the process of embryogenesis and gestation and the development of limbs from single cells at the start of the period of gestation over 9 months, and things like ecosystem dynamics, complex ecosystem dynamics emerging from the interactions between different species. So that whole section of the paper is trying to draw out the fact that this worldview produces a kind of progress that is necessarily going to miss some of the most important and meaningful aspects of reality. And because it's not missing it, it cannot care to notice the ways in which it's being harmed. And so it's dangerously incomplete.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, a lot of people talk about is sort of how interconnected our world is. It's almost become like a trendy thing to say, like, oh, everything's connected. And one of the reasons I actually chose the name of this podcast to use the word entangled is because I wanted it to sort of speak to that it's not that there's nodes and these things are connected and there's lots of nodes everywhere and there's this sort of like linear connections between the nodes, but it's much messier than that. And the things that arise in our world are much messier than sort of linear connections to multiple things. So I appreciated that the paper kind of got into that distinction of emergence and why that matters, especially as it relates to this idea of progress. One of the things I wanted to make sure that we talk about is perverse incentives. So, we on this podcast, we talk a lot about perverse incentives being one of the underlying generative dynamics of the meta crisis. And I was thinking about this. Last weekend, I actually ended up watching this movie on Netflix that it's a few years old, but I hadn't seen it, so I watched it, called Dark Waters. I don't know if you've heard of that. So it's about the DuPont Corporation, and which essentially, contaminated a town with a toxic chemical called PFOA. And it was commonly used in all sorts of household materials. One of the most well-known was Teflon. So, the sort of coating that's on pans that make them nonstick. And so, people were cooking on this surface, and eventually it was discovered that the chemical was toxic. People started getting cancers, they were dying. And after a long, drawn-out legal battle, eventually the chemical was banned. But then, by then, thousands of people had died from it. And it got me thinking about the fact that there are thousands of chemicals like PFOA that kind of fall under this umbrella of PFAS, the commonly known as forever chemicals. And they've been in the news recently because there's been studies that have shown that it's been found in human blood and rainfall and even the most pristine parts of the world. And it's kind of shocking to think that these chemicals are in products that we all interact with on a daily basis. And when you think about why, it's really important to consider perverse incentives that are driving the profit maximizing behavior of the companies that are producing them. And, we rely on our governments and our institutions to protect us from risks like things like chemical pollution. And one of the things that was stated in the paper is that legislation is failing to bind perverse incentives. So can you talk a little bit about why our current legal and regulatory frameworks are really no longer up to the task of protecting us from harm?
I think that it would also be reasonable to argue that, in a sense, our institutions like the FDA, like the EPA, they were never really up to the task of protecting us in the first place, because we produce novel chemicals as part of the global economy. A market exists for them, so they are brought into existence. But setting an exposure limit provides a false sense of security. It can never capture the complexity or the nuance of biological reality. A certain amount of any given chemical will probably have a very different effect in me compared to a baby, or in a pregnant woman compared to an old person. There are going to be a wide range of effects. A single limit is never going to capture the kind of complexity that will flow from introducing something totally new into the complex system of the body. And as you rightly say, exposure limits have to be set because we've invented a chemical that has an application somewhere in the market, and an industry exists for the production of such chemicals, right? So an incentive is perverse when it is harming some aspect of reality that we rely upon or we depend upon or we need in some way, right? And so this is perverse in the sense that we are producing things that are obviously bad for us and hampering our functional health and our well-being. But we keep doing it because there is an extrinsic motivation to do it. There is a reason for a company to still produce it so they can make a profit. And then all of these codependent industries and businesses and livelihoods and securities exist around this thing that is actually net harmful to the biosphere. Because the market demands the chemical for a purpose, the default position has to be, in effect, that every chemical is safe up to a limit until it's proven otherwise. a market pressure exists for the safety limit to be above zero. But it's important to recognize that in the evolutionary environment that produced life, the amount of these synthetic chemicals was zero, none. Like there were none of them there. And in that context, we got this blossoming of life in the biosphere that led to complex intelligent organisms like us.
Mm-hmm.
That is not the world we live in anymore. Now we are all exposed continuously to hundreds of millions of novel synthetic chemicals. And if we're all exposed to these kind of known carcinogens or endocrine disruptors, each one at or below the known legal limit, then what is the cumulative effect on the body?
Right.
There's no test. There is no test that can tell us anything about the cumulative effects of all of the chemicals in our air and our food and our water. But there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the rising rates of cancer, of endocrine disorders, of chronic complex disease, that they're linked to the increasing exposure to the full range of novel synthetic compounds that now exist within us and that we exist alongside in all contexts. One of the things that we looked at for this paper was the American Chemical Society and their live database of all known chemical substances. Current count is somewhere in the region of 279 million chemicals. And that's an unimaginably large number, right? It's
like ridiculous to even think about. Like it's such a ridiculous number. Yeah.
And in that number, simple compounds of known metals and also things like VX poison gas, right? There's a full range of substances, many of which will have complex effects in the body we can't even begin to hope to understand right now. We don't understand the systems of the body at a molecular level that make us who we are. We don't understand the ways in which novel synthetic compounds can affect those things and how those effects can have other knock-on effects and how these chemicals might act in complex interplay in combination with other chemicals. And so this process that we go through, the process we live in as a part of an industrial global civilization, is that we mine elements from the Earth's crust that have previously been bound there outside of the biosphere, technically. And then we put them through this process of industrial processing, chemical separation and manufacturing, the things that are necessary for extraction and purification of substances that can then be sold for a market purpose. And by doing that, every time we do that, we are leaching into the biosphere a whole set of compounds and substances that we don't really understand the total effect of in relation to all life, not just human health and well-being, right? But all life and the complex systems of life in nature that sustain everything, the production of food, all of the complex ecosystem dynamics that make the world habitable as a biosphere. And so we're directly undermining this delicate balance of elements within the biosphere that enabled the evolution of intelligent life in the first place. You can think of it as a Goldilocks zone. And we know the concept of the Goldilocks zone from astrophysics, from the point at which the distance the planet can be from a sun for it to have surface water that can sustain and be a harbor for life. And of the Goldilocks zone that we look at planets in, you can think of the Goldilocks zone in biospheric terms, in terms of the elements present in the biosphere. You have to make sure that there aren't all of these toxic things like lead, which is otherwise locked underground. You don't want a biosphere full of lead because lead is neurotoxic and it can harm growth and development. And so we are debasing the very substrate upon which all life depends. And we have built a world system that relies on incredible energy production and material extraction and manufacturing process. And all of that involves the gradual accumulation of synthetic chemicals and novel compounds in all parts of our reality, in our consumer products and in our air and water and food. And because they're unavoidably everywhere, they end up in our bloodstreams and in our brains, in our organs, our joints, our bones. And they disrupt these systems that are only just beginning to tease apart in terms of understanding the systems of life and systems of biology at a deep level that we can barely conceive of. And so, the institutions that aim to protect us from this kind of toxic damage, they're operating on the basis of incredibly limited knowledge. And the gap between their understanding and reality, it grows ever greater with each new novel synthetic substance we're adding to the database of 279 million that already exist. And because we can't understand all the effects and because the market pressure exists, We just have to assume they're safe until we're proven otherwise. And then we get this kind of post hoc regulatory approach.
Yeah.
Oh, look at this damage. Let's go back and regulate around it. And we do this across all industries where there is a significant risk of damage or destruction or death. And so, of course, this is enabling kind of harm that we can't meaningfully protect against or measure.
I think you wrote about this in the paper, like the airline industry, because there is such catastrophic harm that can happen if an airline goes down in terms of risk of death, that there are many pretty stringent guidelines and frameworks that airlines are required to follow in order to fly their airlines. And I think this topic is actually really relevant as we're thinking about artificial intelligence and what's happening in that space, particularly given the speed of development that is taking place with artificial intelligence, of course, driven by perverse incentives like a race to get to AGI. And when you think about a technology like AI, the potential risks that exist from it are so immense that our current regulatory frameworks are just really not able to keep up. I mean, even if you think about things like the fact that the people who are developing these technologies are, some of this quite intelligent people who deeply understand the technical aspects that go into building these AI models. The people who are regulating them don't understand those topics at a deep level. And so how do you regulate something that you don't even really understand? And so this, I appreciated that there was a part of the paper that talked about, the kind of precautionary principle that when the risk of something is so great that you need to take a precautionary approach to it and not just release it out into the market and hope it doesn't cause damage and then try to clean it up afterwards, because we are in many ways reaching the limits of our civilization being able to clean up the messes that we make.
Yeah. It's there was a lot to say about AI at the moment, obviously. But let's start with the aviation point you made, right? I think it's quite an insightful example. What we have there is a technology that we invented where there is a potential for major damage. There are extreme consequences for it going wrong, whether the going wrong involves an accident or mechanical failure, or whether it involves like malicious use, like a terrorist attack or something. And because a lot of harm can be done, and it's very easy to imagine, like you can picture the horror of a plane crash. Like it's terrifying and awful. Because a lot of harm can be done, we have built really stringent regulatory frameworks to minimize crashes or terrorist attacks. In fact, when you think about it, there's this vast ecosystem of technologies and regulatory frameworks that exist around the entire aviation industry that the whole thing depends upon. If you think about customs and border protocols and baggage scanning and all of the technologies associated with that whole world, and then engineering safety processes and checks and this kind of like the ritual that has been built up over time, this in the technology and regulatory stack that exists to ensure that there aren't major accidents in the aviation industry. All of these things bring into being the need for other new dependent technologies and governance structures. And it is, when you take a look at it, it's really complicated. It's really complicated and expensive, but obviously it has to be. Consequences of it going wrong are death and destruction on a horrific scale, right? So the reason this is useful as a framework for thinking about advanced technologies like AI or synthetic biology, as you mentioned before, is because those forms of technology they're not just like the aviation industry. They're not just like a plane crash that could kill hundreds of people. They are existential level technologies that are growing exponentially in terms of their power and potential impact and speed of deployment. So when you have a technology that is both existential, it can affect the very nature of human existence, and it's growing exponentially. Its power is growing exponentially. It's existential and exponential. Then you're talking about something that could make aviation disasters look relatively small by comparison, right? These are totally new capabilities that can undermine the very nature of the biosphere in a catastrophic way. So it's not unreasonable to suggest, I think in these cases, that there are a few grounding principles to avoid us having to learn after the fact the way we did with everything else.
Mhm.
Like a few big air disasters tightens things up on the regulatory framework surrounding the aviation industry. That's usually how we do it. But we wait for a disaster to occur. And then when we feel awful, we've got a strong motivation for getting around to ensure it never happens again.
Yeah.
But tech like AI and synthetic biology has the potential, doesn't even have the potential. I think it's pretty indisputable to say that it is so powerful that we really don't want to leave it till afterwards. Maybe there is no afterwards to restrict its use. So yeah, we should be aiming for this fundamental principle of systematic caution with new powerful tools. Increased capability or capacity of a tool also means increased risk. And when there is this step functioning capability that we see with tools like AI, there needs to be a corresponding step function in the safety assessment and the kind of level of regulation around it. And the culture we have in the environment that's building AI right now is the culture of contemporary tech innovation and VC. It's move fast and break things and innovate disruptively. And these are really efficient ways to privatize the gains of new exciting tools and technologies in their turn, and so slows the losses to everyone else and to everyone else and to the biosphere at large. And so if we're talking about technologies where there is a really plausible chance of destroying life as we know it, then there is obviously no kind of positive benefit that can justify the taking of that kind of risk. And that's where we can bring in the precautionary principle under uncertainty, where there is meaningful uncertainty, very high consequentiality, where the negative outcomes are irreversible. Obviously, the burden of proof has to be on safety, not on risk. And that's obviously not the way we're doing it right now.
Okay. So at this point in the conversation, people listening might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed and, wondering, how does one take any action in the world without causing unintended harm? So I want to bring in that I love that the second part of the paper really begins to address how we can do better. One of the really practical frameworks that is discussed in the paper is called prudent problem solving, which is really, a process that anyone can use to attempt to problem solve in a way that is less likely to create new problems in the process. And I won't go through all the steps. People can read the paper, but I did want to highlight something about this that I think is really worth kind of picking out, which is that the first 3 steps of prudent problem solving are actually about trying to determine if there's even a legitimate problem to solve. And if so, then determining the root causes. And so the first line of solution should always attempt to remove the causes, because the optimal kind of response is to something, to a problem, is often less of a new thing, not more of a new thing. And I think this is so antithetical to how our culture typically teaches us to be, rewards us, right? There's this sort of inherent reward around innovation and constantly putting new things out into the world. And so with prudent problem solving, you're first trying to determine, is there even a legitimate problem to solve? And then if there is, you're still not actually ready to move forward in the world and take action. And then you talk about yellow teaming. So I thought we could talk a little bit about yellow teaming, and if you could just unpack kind of what it is and why it's important to give people a flavor of, there are things that anyone can start doing right now. Do we need massive systems change? Yes. Do we need change in our economic systems? Yes. In our regulatory governance structures? Yes. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways that we can begin responding right now that can start to internalize some of the harms.
Yeah, these tools that we have been developing at CRI, these are not complicated things. These are like principled, common sense, simple frameworks for thinking through the full range of effects of a new technology before you just release it into the wild, right? So it's a way of doing a better job at predicting and stopping the harms before they become real, a better job than we're doing right now, at least. We're not trying to say, by the way, that it is possible to predict all of the externalities of a new technology. No one's trying to suggest that. we're simply trying to say that if we just keep doing things the way we're doing them now, the consequences are going to get increasingly severe. So these tools are designed to just stop the accumulation of increasing harm before they become manifest in reality, right? So prudent problem solving, which is the first thing you mentioned, and Yellow Team are kind of these tools that you can move between to help understand whether the thing you are thinking about doing, the problem you are seeking to address, the tool you're trying to build, the technology you're trying to invent, whether it's addressing a real problem that exists in reality that needs a new technology to address it, or whether it's a problem that we can relate to differently and there's actually real meaning to be drawn from embracing that problem. So proven problem solving is just a stepwise process that leads you through this process of coming into contact with the problem in a way that allows you to reframe it, to take you to a place where you're really questioning the need for a new technology. So you, as you said, you've got to identify the problem or the values that you're trying to serve. Then you make this inquiry as to whether it's a real problem that needs to be addressed or a feature of reality to relate to differently. I've heard Daniel talk about things like the perishability of food. Like, is that something that we need tech to solve, which obviously usually involves chemicals or some kind of complex treatment? Or is it something that helps us relate to the fact that all things die? Like, changes the way we view our locality and the way food is produced and what we put into our bodies. Like, we lose valuable lessons if we just technologically solve the problem of food perishing. And you talk about even simpler examples like, do I make the choice to drive to the shops or do I walk? Like, is the problem that the shops are far away something that I need a technological solution to solve, or do I lose something by introducing technology to solve that problem? And of course, you lose the ability to be outside, to move through the world and experience bird song and get fitter and healthier and relate to time and space in a different way, in a more healthy, holistic way. So there's this framing where it just asks you to really consider whether it is something you just need to relate to differently, that all things might be better served by relating to it differently. And then if there really is still a problem, then go upstream, look at the origins of the problem. Don't see the problem that is before you and try and think about a tool that might solve that problem, because maybe the answer is that there is something in reality now that we should be reducing the amount of. We should be taking something away rather than adding something new. And particularly where the causes are anthropogenic, where they're caused by humans, that's obviously the answer in many cases. And then you go into the stage of looking at equivalent situations where the problem doesn't occur. So you can think, for example, about homelessness. If you're working for a charity that's trying to solve the problem of homelessness in your city, look at other cities that don't have a problem with homelessness and try and identify the principal differences and whether there's anything you can learn from the place that doesn't have a homelessness problem and apply to your locality. And then if there's nothing that you can find there, then think about repurposing existing technologies with a known safety profile. A really good example of this is Project Redo, which is looking to take known drugs with long-term safety data and see if they have an effect on cancer. And so it's like a repurposing of existing drugs. So it's not inventing a new drug that will involve billions of dollars in many years and loads of externalities that are hard to calculate. It is, okay, we already got this technology. It probably has a bunch of externalities, but we do know it is safe to a certain degree. Can we repurpose it for the problem at hand? Only when you've gone through this process of eliminating all of these other contingent factors, then you come to a place where you start to think about what might be needed, what might be involved with the invention of a new technology, which leads into yellow teaming. Yellow teaming is a framework for thinking about solution design inspired by the processes of red teaming and blue teaming. So red teaming was originally a military strategy game where you take part of your team, you take some people from your team and you put them in the red team. You label them the red team and they become the attackers. It's their job to embody the mindset of the attacker and try and attack the thing that you're trying to protect. So the red team will do all they can to break in or to break down, to break something. And this process, this gaming found a real home in cybersecurity. So now you can pay cyber consultants to hack your business and then produce a report for all of the weaknesses. So that's red teaming. Red teaming is breaking something down. Blue teaming is thinking through all the ways in which you can safeguard. So these processes are like simulated games that you can run to ensure that your thing, your project, your plan, your technology, your business is better equipped to do what it's trying to do in the world, either by learning about its vulnerabilities or improving its defenses. So we've taken that and expanded that idea in a different direction, which is to think about all the ways in which the technology or project touches all aspects of reality over the full course of its lifetime. It's essentially externality mapping, right? It's trying to think about all of the other domains that the tool you are making might touch and the impacts it might have so that you can attempt to mitigate them in advance, right? So it's trying to anticipate unintended outcomes or unexpected harms as far as reasonably possible. And one of the important concepts that underlies this is this sense that we tend to think about new technologies linearly. We have a new tool, it will have this effect. This effect is the intended effect. But in fact, it will inevitably be used in every possible way that's afforded by its design, by all potential users out in time. Like as time expands, it enables new affordances as part of its design, whether you intended it or not. And so where those affordances intersect with the motivations of all users, all possible users, that is how it will be used. And the world you get, the world that's delivered by new technology, will depend on the motivations that are upregulated by those affordances. And a really good example of this, to make it simple, is Twitter, right? Twitter was designed as a microblogging platform. So the idea was that you'd share ideas in tweet form, these short little idea sharing things, and you build a community, and that's a nice little social media platform where you can meet friends and talk about stuff.
Yeah. I remember when it first came out and I was like, this is so stupid. Who's going to use this?
I remember.
I was wrong.
What a stupid idea. This is never going to work. It's like, we're not in tech design. Well, but when in its design, in that design that obviously a niche was spotted in how people were talking and how the online community was growing, and it became this massive cultural phenomenon that it is now. In that design, it enabled a wider range of activities that users were motivated to pursue, even though the designers hadn't intended it that way. And so it was used to tweet out thoughts and ideas, but it was also used to amplify narratives, like motivated narratives through the use of bots and anonymous accounts and troll farms. It was used for information warfare and political propaganda and targeted social engineering. And all of those things were enabled by the affordances of the platform and the motivations of the people who ended up using it. But we didn't think about them in advance. Now imagine if we had really carefully thought about all the ways that people might use this platform if it got really popular and loads of people were on there and it became like a town square, as people call it. Then we might have designed in advance a set of features that stopped it becoming that way, or at least oriented it in a slightly different direction. And then we'd have a comprehensively different world, right? We could make the choice now to redesign social media technologies for better outcomes in general. We could choose, for example, to take something like X as a platform and make sure that the algorithm is upregulating content that inspires positive sentiment across ideological divides. So you've got a left-leaning political tribe, a right-leaning political tribe. What is the content that they both engage with in a similar way? Okay. If that's the thing that's at the top of the algorithm's weighting distribution, then you end up with a world that, I mean, it's hard to say exactly what kind of world you end up with, but what you can say is that it will point us in a direction that might inspire a sense of commonality between groups who had previously viewed themselves as being opposing. We might be able to generate a bit more kind of goodwill. So I think, it's a different trajectory to the one that we're on now, which is increasing political polarization and fragmentation. Like these are design choices we could choose to make, but instead we're choosing to prioritize near-term profit at the expense of a functional society. And so the point of yellow teaming and proven problem solving is to try and build in advance these perspectives on the way tools are going to be used so as to mitigate some of the extremes of the damage that can flow if they're not designed with adequate care and thought.
Yeah. Let's turn the conversation a little bit to talk about wisdom. I think this part of the paper was really one of my favorite parts of the paper. And there is a paragraph that reads, Science can tell us about what is in the world, but it cannot tell us about what ought to be. The is-ought distinction cannot be bridged by scientific investigation. What is falls essentially within the realm of the third person, while what ought to be falls within the realm of the second. In other words, between and in concert with other beings. In the absence of guiding values to help us determine the goodness of a particular outcome, decisions tend to be made in a manner that prioritizes winning. In other words, operating within the world on the basis of what is, but not what ought to be, tends to result in choices being determined by the logic of game theory, or what it takes to win or to feel good, in a narrow sense, regardless of all the costs. So in other words, science can provide insights into how to achieve our goals more effectively, but it cannot tell us about the goodness of our goals. That knowledge comes from elsewhere. And to me, that is wisdom. And that's what our culture is lacking. And so we could spend an entire podcast talking about the topic of wisdom. It's obviously quite a deep one. But I wanted for us to just begin to unpack this topic a little bit. How do you think that we become more wise as individuals and as a collective?
I think the first thing I'd say is that there are obviously a whole range of people better equipped to answer this question who you could have this discussed. But I can offer some general reflections, right? In the context of the kind of wisdom that we need to get to at a civilizational level to mitigate catastrophic and existential risks.
Yeah.
We'll start at the level of the individual though, right? I think what you were describing there is wisdom in relation to goal setting, right? And you were simply stating that, the worldview that says knowledge will give us the answer, right? That all problems are in effect problems of insufficient knowledge. Then the idea of wisdom poses a particular question to that worldview, right? How do you discern what is right in the application of knowledge? How do you know when not to act, for example? It can't be that you simply acquire knowledge, you acquire more and more knowledge, and then over time you will just know when not to act. Because at some point in that process, you will need to make a judgment call that's based on the relative value of different potential outcomes, of trade-offs, right? You have to make a trade-off. And then we end up in a place of moral or ethical consideration. And that is not something that just knowledge alone can answer, right? That is the thing that you're referring to that comes beyond knowledge, comes from beyond knowledge. So when you think about what is wisdom, what's the definition? A common definition of wisdom is something like the ability to make sound judgments or decisions on the basis of knowledge and experience and understanding. And so in making decisions or solving problems, knowledge provides us with an understanding of the options or the tools or the methods available to us, whereas wisdom is the thing which helps us to determine which tools to use and when. Right? When to use them in the context of longer term consequences or outcomes. I don't think it's controversial to suggest that these are different things, and that in the presence of powerful new technologies, the wisdom part is actually a vital factor in how we develop them and how we develop those tools and how we deploy them. So what can we take for the individual level? Like, what does it mean for an individual to grow wise? It's obviously something that is developed over time and with experience. It's something that comes from a process of continuous learning and an orientation towards the world that is open to new perspectives and frameworks for thinking, and not holding too closely to any of the ideologies that you might be able to recognize within yourself. It's about learning from mistakes and about critical thinking and the practice of empathy and the ability to embody multiple perspectives. Like, these are classical hallmarks of individual wisdom, right? Then there's also things like blind spots and biases. Becoming clearer on where our own dispositions, our own personal histories and traumas are holding us back in terms of how we're making sense of the world in a way that actually reflects reality and not what we'd actually just quite like to be out there in the world. So it's about having this fundamental interest in what's real, and what really matters, and like a constant awareness of our own internal motivations that might be distorting our assessment. So it's like asking the question, like, where am I tricking myself? And these are things that lead to a growing awareness of the fact that there are good, true, beautiful paths to take, and then there are the paths of simply what is, right? One of the frameworks that's worth bringing up in this context is epistemic humility, which in one of the Consilience Project papers, we talk about at great length. Epistemic humility is about neither being too confident in our conclusions and our knowledge that we hold now, and at the same time, also being kind of nihilistic with regard to the possibility of knowing anything at all for certain. So it's this like orientation to the world that does seek that new learning thing and recognizes there are limits to knowledge. And I think that this is something that I can feel in relation to my own experience of growing up. As you get older, you develop this capacity to look back at the time when you were younger. I can look back at my teenage self and have this kind of amazement, internal amazement, certainty that I existed with. I lived my life with such certainty, thinking I knew everything.
Yeah.
I can look back now and think, wow, I really did hear everything. What an idiot I was. I thought I knew what mattered most, what was of greatest value, but actually, obviously, I didn't know anything. I didn't know how much I didn't know. And that kind of humility is what comes with an increasing awareness of all the things we don't know. The more we learn, the more we understand what we do not know, the greater the awareness of the limitations of our own knowledge. And so all these components of conventional wisdom can be applied to how we go about setting goals. So we can say that one part of wisdom is our ability to determine which goals are good goals. And so in relation to progress, like, we should be considering how our success in achieving goals might affect the wider world, how it might affect us in ways we hadn't even imagined. And so it's pretty clear to see that if we have wisdom in relation to goal setting, we would try and set goals that don't lead to the concentration of power. Because when you get that, you tend to get like massive inequality and enduring types of harm and exploitation, because the people with the power want to hold on to power at the expense of the powerless. You can say that it practices restraint, that restraint is an important part of wisdom, because some of the things that we might want in the near term, that we might desire strongly in the near term, are actually meaningfully detrimental to our longer term goals or our underlying values. And wisdom would also tend to avoid the development of social traps, arms races, where the individuals or groups involved in an arms race are driven by short-term benefits, which are in fact harmful to everyone, including themselves in the long run. So taking that set of thoughts and applying it to civilization and progress, we can say that we're in a place now where the power that's afforded to us by our current set of technologies, it has the potential to enable destruction and creation on a totally unprecedented scale. And so wisdom here involves knowing when to pause. It involves knowing when to invest more in safety analysis and assessment. When to question whether it's a good idea to release such power out into the world without careful analysis, or without meaningfully adequate testing and evaluation. And whether it's a good idea to enter into a race with rivals to develop it in the first place. And so the first step, that's probably like this collective recognition that these are the dynamics that are currently driving the development of our advanced tech now. The question where you talked about military tech development, it's sobering to look at the state of advanced military tech now. We are developing space-based laser systems, ultra short pulse lasers and high frequency microwave beams that can fire continuously at any target on Earth. We've developed and tested hypersonic missiles that you can put nuclear bombs on and that cannot be shot down. They travel 5 times the speed of sound. These things have been tested. We talked about drone swarms, autonomously controlled drone swarms. Like, these things are being pursued with tremendous resource and passion in part of a race dynamic that it would obviously be much wiser not to do. and it's delivering a global context, which is much less safe for everyone, regardless of your wealth or your location. Right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think maturity, like wisdom, maturity, these concepts are related, and it comes down to kind of caring enough to notice, and then taking action, making change to address the issues you've identified. And obviously, the kind of changes at the level of a technological arms race are going to involve totally new kinds of regulation, like totally new kinds of diplomacy and outreach, stuff that we've never done before, new kinds of governance structures. And that may sound unrealistic, but it's also important to consider that we've not really had a clear incentive to invest lots of time or money or human creativity in this effort before. And who knows what we might be able to achieve with only a tiny fraction of the current investment we're seeing in the race for AI dominance right now.
Yeah.
Which isn't something we've explored. And so we don't know what the possibility set is.
Yeah, I think about our sort of modern nation state model, which has basically been in existence for about 400 years, which is really, really a tiny blip in the grand span of humanity's existence on this planet. And I think we can often fall into the traps of thinking that just because something's been in existence for a long time, that there's really no way to change it. But I think it's really important to make the distinction between things that are sort of natural physical laws of the universe versus like human man-made systems that we created at one point and that we can change. And so, while these issues that we're talking about are really complex and difficult, it's not that there's nothing that we can do about it. And I think one of the things I want to make sure that people who are listening feel is that there is actually just exactly what you were saying. There is this really wide, expansive space of responses to our current predicament that we have just barely started to scratch the surface. And so to me, that's really exciting. And that's really what keeps me motivated to keep trying to work towards, leaving this place a little bit better than it was when I came into it, I hope.
Yeah, no, you're entirely right. And I think it's a very kind of inspiring, hopeful thing to realize that the possibility space, potential solutions is vaster than we can possibly imagine. And it's just hard to get into that realm of thinking and design in the current paradigm. But, or as you said, all of the world of political economies and infrastructure and governance that we know now is man-made. It can be remade by humans. It doesn't have to be this way. And there are probably a whole bunch of creative solutions that are hard to conceive of in advance, but will seem incredibly obvious in hindsight, as most. And it is an uplifting thing to consider that kind of optimistic phase space for exploration that we haven't yet really got into.
Yeah. Okay, so before we get to our closing question, I actually wanted to read the last paragraph of the paper because I think it's really beautiful and inspiring. As far as we know, places like our biosphere are rare in the vastness of the cosmos. There is no statement that can capture even a fraction of the value that has come into being on the surface of this small planet, or what it means to experience it over the course of a lifetime. To say that it is infinitely precious will have to suffice. What we can say definitively, though, is that it is incomparably tiny, and that everything we care about depends on it. For the things that we care about to persist, this infinitely precious place must be served and protected in a manner that we are demonstrably failing to achieve now. Our world of economics, politics, infrastructure, and institutions is not a foregone conclusion. It is defined by the choices and actions of humans, and it can be remade by humans. What we need to avert catastrophe is both fundamentally possible and, at the same time, no less than what is required to bring about a radically healthier, kinder, and safer world. Bringing this potential world into being represents a far better story for humanity than that which is offered by the current progress narrative. Being a part of the development in progress, in service to all life in perpetuity, would be a far more meaningful existence than the one you're living now. So, in closing, Alex, my last question for you is, who would you like to platform on the podcast?
There are so many people that I think it would be worth your time speaking to. But there are a few people who we have come into contact with in our networks that I would love to see you speak to. And they include people like Ian McGilchrist. I know you've referenced several times in other conversations you've had here. Liv Boeree and Indy Johar. Those are the names I would put to you.
Wonderful. Alex, thank you so much for all your work on this topic. I, really encourage everyone to go and read the Development and Progress paper. It's such a critical topic to be exploring right now, this time that we find ourselves in. Our friend Zach Stein calls it the time between worlds. And it is really a humbling, I think, realization to just think about that, to think about that we are at a point in civilization where a new world is yet to be born. Our existing world may be dying in some respects, but there is a new world yet that is to be born. And so I think we all have the responsibility to really explore what progress means to us and how our definition of progress will actually lead to an authentically better world. So thank you so much for all your work, and thank you for coming on the podcast to talk to me today.
Thank you. Thank you for everything that you do. This is a great platform, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Thank you, Alex.
If you liked the episode and want to hear more conversations where we explore how a more beautiful world might emerge, subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast app or the Entangled World Pod YouTube channel. If you loved it, support the project at patreon.com/Entangled World. Thank you for listening and for coming on this journey together.